Hey everybody, KMO here. Today is March 24th, 2026. In the spring of 2010, 16 years ago, I was living at the Eco Village Training Center in Summertown, Tennessee, and I decided to turn a set of early C-Realm podcast interviews into a book. At the time, that was a pretty ambitious self-publishing project compared to what it would be today. There was no AI transcription, and there weren't the same kinds of turnkey self-publishing pipelines that now make that sort of thing much easier. But I was briefly seized by an ambitious spirit, and I got the project done in a matter of weeks. The result was Conversations on Collapse, C-Realm podcast transcripts. And what you're about to hear is not something I just now assembled. This recording goes back to the original creation of Conversations on Collapse. I put it together at the time as a sampler to send to Doug Lane, whose name is in the file name. Doug went on to become a well-known podcaster and public intellectual in his own right, and he was one of the people who came along partly under the influence of the C-Realm podcast. So this audio is also a small artifact from that moment. Now, 16 years later, I'm returning to that material from a different angle. The new project is called Getting Over Collapse. It won't be just another collection of transcripts. It's shaping up to be a reflection on the worldview I was caught up in at the time and an attempt to unpack it, with the benefit of time and distance. I'm not going to try to do all of that here because I've got a lot of material I want to share with you, but if you'd like to follow the progress of Getting Over Collapse, head on over to crealm.org. That's crealm.org, not crealm.com. The .com website is what's left of the C-Realm podcast archive. The newer .org site is one that is focused on my current projects, including Getting Over Collapse. So once again, c-realm.org. I don't have time to say something about each of the people you're about to hear, but the first and last voice in this collection of excerpts is that of Dmitri Orlov. He played a pivotal role in changing the direction of the C-Realm podcast, which is why my first conversation with him makes up the first chapter of Conversations on Collapse. Since the peak oil scene dissolved, and the people who gathered under that banner went their different ways, I know many of you do not approve, not only of some of the trajectories those people have taken, but also of the newer narratives they've gravitated toward, Dmitri included. I'm not going to get into any of that here. What I will say is that Dmitri was my introduction to peak oil. I had heard the phrase before, but I mostly associated it with people I didn't particularly want to hear from. What changed that was a slide deck from a PowerPoint presentation Dmitri had done called Closing the Collapse Gap. This was before he was blogging regularly, before any of his books, before he had much of a public profile at all. All I had seen were those slides, but that was enough to make me think I need to get this guy on the podcast. And really, it was Dmitri who put me on the peak oil vector. Once I had spoken with people like James Howard Kunstler and Albert Bates, it became much easier to keep interviewing people associated with the peak oil worldview. But Dmitri was my point of entry. And what I'll say for him, entirely to his credit, is that he was always entertaining to interview. He did not rely on a set of safe, prepackaged talking points. He was willing to take chances. He was willing to think out loud. In the next hour, you're going to hear at least one person who really did sound locked into a fixed set of polished lines. Dmitri was not that guy. He was willing to perform without a net. So this first excerpt comes from episodes 21 and 22 of the C-Realm podcast. Episode 21 was called Closing the Disinfo Gap, and episode 22 was called Space. They were released on February 14th and February 21st, 2007.
In the United States, people who stay away from doctors tend to be healthier than people who don't. So if you want to live long and be healthy, don't go see a doctor. In this country. In other countries, it's different in some places. But here, it's basically a bunch of people who are there to push pharmaceuticals on you. And, the more experimental the pharmaceuticals, the better. So if you have some really strange symptoms, you're a gold mine for a doctor or for a pharmaceutical company. And they're not likely to help you anyway. They're just going to, treat you as a lab animal. But in general, you can read up on the statistics. People who stay away from doctors generally do better in terms of health. And, the more general point is, okay, well, nobody has a retirement. Everybody knows that. Now, why is that? Well, that's because everybody has been basically spending money they don't have. People in this country can't afford to drive cars. They can't afford to live out in suburbia. None of these things are things that they can afford. And so there are credit card companies to take advantage of the fact that, they're living beyond their means and they don't care, that they're basically destroying their future. And so I don't know if it's really all that immoral to help people destroy their future if that's what they want to do. Um, but seeing an entire country try to do this is a little, disappointing, I would say.
Certainly, we are all responsible for the situations that we create for ourselves, and we are all responsible for exercising financial prudence. But at the same time, vast fortunes have been made by seducing folks with easy credit and with a constant barrage of imagery, which describes the lifestyle of a happy, successful person in the United States.
Well, that's another difference between the Soviet Union and the United States, that turned out to be to the advantage of the Soviet Union, which is American propaganda is very good. There's all this advertising, all this marketing, seducing people and doing things that are bad for them. And Soviet propaganda was heavy-handed, it was kind of ugly, and it was not seducing people. It was trying to basically harangue and browbeat people into doing things that were good for them. Now it turns out that human nature is such that people won't respond very well to that treatment. Humans like to be seduced. They like to be, cajoled, and they like to do things that are bad for them if somebody tells them that that's okay. So in terms of that, Soviet propaganda pretty much made people kind of think for themselves a little bit, you know, and American propaganda kills that, so you have very few people in this country, there's all this talk about individualism, but really it's very much a herd mentality kind of country, where everybody thinks that, it's okay to have credit cards. It's okay to, max out your credits. It's fine. That's what everybody's doing. And the thing is, I've seen a lot of just really horrendous suffering, and so I can't really be sort of lighthearted about it. Oh, capitalism is going to fall apart. People are not going to be exploited anymore. How wonderful. The fact is that, it's going to be really painful to watch, and that's the part that I don't like about it.
That was Dmitri Orlov. Next up is Albert K. Bates, and what you're about to hear was either in episode 29 of the C-Realm podcast. It was called Corporatized, and that was released on April 18th, 2007, or the next episode, Vine of the Soul, which was released on the 25th of April, 2007.
I think that what I'm seeing is a race. It's a race between whether we will attain a degree of consciousness on this planet. And it's a race between whether we're going to have a habitable planet or whether we'll attain as life forms on this planet some form of cosmic consciousness in time to finish out this experiment that was begun many billions of years ago. And I think that what I've been seeing in this last few weeks or months is some warning signs that we're not winning our race, that Gaia is in a lot worse trouble than we thought. And I'm seeing all of this, and it's sad to say it, but it seems to me that history might indeed be ending. And if climate change tips us into a desert world, and it does it in less than 1,000 years, maybe even 100 years, instead of 1 billion years, well, it's our fault. That blame is pretty useless. So what was the end result of the experiment? Some would say that the purpose of the experiment of having life on this planet was to lift off consciousness, to transcend the corporeal realm and to start working consciousness through various dimensions. And for the past many decades, that's what we've been doing. Albert Hofmann discovered LSD about the end of the 1940s. You had Gordon Wasson going down to meet with the curanderos in Mexico in the 50s. you had a lot of people who were gaining this exploration, and in fact, that those numbers have been expanding every year, and time is now getting very short, and we have to wonder whether we're going to make it to the finish line in time. That's the race I see underway, and who knows how it's going to come out. But I think whoever is engaged in this exploration is doing the heavy lifting for all life on Earth at this point. It's absolutely essential work, and it's much more important than sending rockets to Mars or building fusion reactors. Consciousness is the most important field of scientific endeavor we could possibly engage right now. And, at the same time, I had to say that I think the age of science may soon be ending and getting way to an age of art, and it'll be artists, not scientists, who save us. I think one of the major problems that we face is that we have this set of expectations that are a part of our education, part of our development as individuals when we're young. And it comes from our heritage, which is out of a kind of, warlike evolutionary process over the course of many centuries. And we see the need to be somehow striving constantly for achievement in some way or shape or form. And I think that that's one of the big problems that we have as a society. It's why we're having the issues that we're having with climate change, because we are overextended. We're overextended on our resource. Our demands on Gaia have greatly exceeded what Gaia's capabilities are. And I think that we have to change that mean. We need to shift. We need to go to a much more less consumptive, but also easygoing society. And I think that probably that's going to happen through education of children more than any other way. Although we need to also think about how do adults change and what are the ways we change adult thinking. And I think arts are one of the ways that we do that. But I think that also the change may not happen fast enough if we wait generationally to make the shifts that we need to make. One of the major changes that has to happen has to deal with population. We have religious and ethical and cultural boundaries that we've placed on large families. We say, okay, we should have people, a lot of religions want you to have more and more kids and prohibit birth control and so forth. And what we find is we get into this situation now where we are exceeding the carrying capacity of the planet with a sudden explosion in the last few hundred years of up to the 6.5 billion of us now, headed on its way to 9 billion. Pretty hard to stop that. And the question is, how do we bring that down? What's the process by which we bring our population down? And I think as we go through this crisis in coming years and have to shift to an agricultural economy, in some ways that even gets harder because people will think of they need their kids in order to help them grow food and to care for them in old age and that sort of thing, which is traditional. And a farming economy is an economy that tends to have large families. But we really have to change. We need to figure out ways to make not having kids more fashionable and to begin to bring the population down by whatever means we can come to. Because if we can't do that in an organized, peaceful way, then nature will take a hand and do it in a way that's not very pleasant.
That was Albert Bates. Next up is Thomas Homer-Dixon. He's the author of a book called The Upside of Down. And my one interview with him, and I only talked to him once, it was quite profound to me in retrospect. And what you're about to hear came from episode number 36, Locus of Agency, released May 30th, 2007.
The most adaptive systems in the world tend to solve their problems through distributed or decentralized action of problem-solving agents. These systems would include market economies, immune systems, or many kinds of ecological systems. They deal with their problems by creating loosely coupled networks of relatively autonomous agents. You think about a market, for example, relatively autonomous firms that each of which can attempt to tackle a part of the problem in experimental ways, and solutions that turn out to be reasonably effective can be communicated across the network quite quickly. And also things that turn out not to work, experiments that fail, that information can also be communicated across the network. decentralized systems and distributed problem solving, those approaches tend to produce solutions to complex problems much faster. They may seem inefficient because you get a lot of experimentation and pursuit of dead ends and a lot of stuff that just doesn't work. But the point is that you need to do a lot of that experimentation to find out what does work. This is fundamentally the distinction between, for instance, the old-style command and control hierarchical Soviet economies and the highly adaptive Western economies. And we saw ultimately that the Soviet economies were incapable of adapting to a rapidly changing global economy and a rapidly changing economic environment, whereas market economies not only were capable of adapting, but in many ways actually defined the larger economic environment. And that, I think, that lesson of the power of distributed systems is one that we need to take to heart. And I think that it's an interesting ideological twist in a way, because you could say that people who are progressive, liberal in the American context, even on the left, need to understand that there are some very important things that we can learn from people whom we would have regarded traditionally as being conservative and on the right. That markets are very effective problem-solving institutions. This is the new kind, I think, of liberalism, a new kind of left-of-center ideology that understands that distributed problem-solving and decentralization is exactly the kind of thing that somebody like Adam Smith was talking about in The Wealth of Nations. And there's a possibility for a constructive dialogue, I think, across ideological divides here. What we've learned, I think, in the recent decades, and this is sort of my point I was trying to make about the Soviet command control economies, is that the top-down hierarchical problem-solving approaches tend not to work in a very dynamic and complex environment. There's a principle derived from complexity theory, the study of complex systems. It's called the law of requisite variety. And it goes something like this, that any system, in order to be successfully adaptive to its environment, has to be as complex as its environment. And that's because the complex environment will produce a certain range of behaviors. If it becomes more complex, it produces a larger range of behaviors. A system that's trying to survive within that complex environment needs to have a repertoire of behaviors that's just as broad as the range of behaviors of its environment. And so it needs to be as complex as its environment. And it turns out that if we're talking about human systems, human decision-making environments, and human problem-solving systems, the hierarchical ones tend to be too simple for what has become an enormously complex world. So we see hierarchies breaking apart. We see tightly controlled corporation going bankrupt and not adapting to their environments. We see social and political systems like the Soviet political system finding themselves incapable of surviving within our new world of recent decades. And I think people on the political left need to understand that we can't return to state-centric solution to the challenges we face. This is why I recommend in much of my work, and I'll be pursuing this issue further in my future research, that we must think a lot more about distributed or decentralized problem solving based electronically on the internet that involves large numbers of people incorporated into some kind of open architecture decision-making or problem-solving process, a kind of wiki process.
Next up is Sharon Astyk. She's the author or co-author of a book called Nation of Farmers, and I think she came to my attention when she was pushing back against Albert Bartlett's metaphor about 20 people having to share a single bathroom. It was an anti-overpopulation metaphor, and she didn't like it. So that is basically the topic of the conversation with Sharon Astyk. Population control, fertility rates, and their trajectories. This is from episode number 42, Tragedy of the Bathroom, released June 20th, 2007.
I should be upfront and say I have 4 children, not entirely intentionally, but I have 4 children and I'm not unhappy about that fact. So there certainly are plenty of people who will say that I am a major contributor to the problem. And honestly, first world children are a much bigger problem than third world children. I mean, I don't actually deny that what I do doesn't meet the requirements of the categorical imperative. That is, everybody can't do what I do and have a livable world. So I just want to get that out of the way up front because, people know this and it's appropriate that sort of I acknowledge my own complicity in this. I think the point at which we have to start dealing with the population issue is right now. But I don't necessarily believe in dealing with it in some of the sort of stronger ways that get floated around among people who feel very strongly about this. That is, I believe that on some level, we are dealing with population growth right now. Since 1950, the world TFR, that's total fertility rate, has fallen from around 5 children per person to about 2.7, which is just an enormous drop in fertility. There is a fertility transition that happened after death rates began to fall due to modern medicine and vaccines and things in the world, is that for a short period of time, people have a lot more children because they haven't quite adapted to the fact that more of their children are going to survive into adulthood. And then you begin to see a demographic transition, which is what demographers call it, where birth rates begin to fall and people start having fewer children. And all over the world, that's actually happening. Now, it's famously happening in places like Europe and Japan, where total fertility rates are, 1.5 and under. But it's also happening in poor countries. It's happening in Sri Lanka, in Thailand, in Kerala, in the state of Kerala, in India, in much of Eastern Europe. And these are places that tend to be quite poor, but where women have simply managed to get to the point where their children are starting to live to adulthood and they are making rational choices. That is, they're choosing to have fewer children. What seems to help World TFR is good education for women, reasonable chances of infant survival rates, which is actually something that does require some medical infrastructure but can be done quite cheaply and doesn't require a lot of medical infrastructure. And the reasonable hope that your kid won't be taken off and killed in some war or something. Essentially, women you could get to have the kids they do have grow up and they have fewer children. We're in the process of a vast demographic transition. It may not be happening as fast as we like. It may not even be happening fast enough, and that's another issue. But it's happening around the world, and it's so the more coercive methods that people advocate, for example, the China-style solutions, actually China's birth rate is still well above a number of poor nations where it's happening voluntarily, including, again, like Sri Lanka and Thailand. I think a lot of people have this vision of agriculture as endless misery and drudgery. They think, oh, God, I'm going to spend the rest of my life, working in the hot sun, sort of, one of those chain gang movies. And one of the things I can say is that it just doesn't have to be that hard. One of my favorite poems is a Wordsworth poem called The Solitary Reaper. And it's about this woman out with the scythe cutting grain, and she's singing while she's doing it. And, when I read it in graduate school, I don't think it ever registered on me that if you can sing while you're doing something, it's not that hard. If you ever try and do it, it's not that much work. It's not that farming isn't work. It can be a lot of work, but there are a lot of methodologies that make it anything but, okay, I'm going to spend the rest of my life swinging a mattock at the clods of dirt for the sands. You don't have to do that stuff. A lot of our models of agriculture have been based on cheap oil. That is, it makes a lot of sense to till up fields with tractors, even though that's really bad for the soil and things if you have all that horsepower. On the other hand, if you have a yard and limited free time, it makes a lot of sense to mulch with your own grass clipping and with the compost that you make on your property and never kill anything at all. Just stir it up a little with a fork and plant some vegetables into it. I know a lot of people who live in neighborhoods and they don't know the people on the other side of them well enough to talk to. But if you depend on other people for help with things that you now have sort of electric servants to do for you, then you have to know your neighbors. You can't get away with that. And that does come with, as Barbara Ehrenreich has pointed out, with some real opportunities for celebration and festivity. Helena Norberg Hodge talks about the Ladakis who live in high plain areas around Tibet, who said that basically they spend 4 months working really hard to get their food, and the rest of the year they spend partying. They drink beer and socialize and have a really good time. Medieval peasants in Britain in the 11th century used to work only 176 days a year. The rest were Sabbaths and festivals, and there was a hogshead of beer for every 6 peasants for every festival. There's a real culture of celebration and of joy and delight that goes around with strong community structures and local economies and local food. The other thing is I think that there's a chance we could get back some of our political power. A lot of people that I know feel very powerless. They feel like their world is run by interests they don't control, and I think that's absolutely true. But when you reduce the scale of your world, when you take away power from corporate hands, when you don't depend on corporations to feed you and clothe you and shelter you, then you can also take back political power. You can get a little closer to sort of the democracy that was imagined by our founding fathers. And I think that alone might be worth an enormous amount of change, is to get back the right to a kind of self-determination that I think a lot of us really have lost.
All right, next up is Albert Bartlett. Albert Bartlett was the guest. I talked to him a couple times, but the interview that provides the segment or the excerpt that you're about to hear is either from episode number 53, Important but Trivial, or episode 54, Malthusian Memes, released August 29th and September 5th, 2007.
Well, we don't have the resources to supply the present world population. The world population today is unsustainable, and you can reach that conclusion by just observing that if any fraction of the present global warming is due to the actions of humans, then this by itself is proof that the human population has exceeded the carrying capacity of the Earth. 200 years ago, oil production worldwide was 0. 200 years from now, it's going to be 0. In between, it rises to 1 or more maxima, and you can approximate that by a smooth error curve. And the real question is, a lot of reporters ask, well, when are we going to run out of oil? And the answer is never. We'll never run out of oil. But the question that has to be asked and understood is, when will oil production peak? When will we pass that peak production? And the peak production marks the point at which we have consumed half of the initial resource. And so after you pass the peak, then production declines and approaches 0, and it may take another 100 years for it to approach 0. It took 100 years to get up to where it is now. But as you have declining production and a growing world population and a growing world per capita demand for oil, then you have all the makings of a real disaster, because everything in our modern society is dependent on oil. And the first thing you think of is that food production. And one can observe that modern agriculture is the use of land to convert petroleum into food. And, we can see rapidly rising prices of petroleum as we pass over the peak. And that'll immediately be reflected in very rapid rises in the cost of food and a cost of everything else in society. Now, where are we with regard to the world peak? The U.S. peaked in 1970, and we're well down on the downhill side of the curve. World production could peak any time now. There are some experts who say the peak has already been passed. My own analysis says we're very close to the peak, and there are the latest I have heard from any from any scientist in the field, a geologist, is about 2020. But I think most of the consensus feeling among people who are really into this problem is that it's much earlier than 2020, that it's any day now. And unfortunately, we won't know when we pass the peak. We could already have passed it. You'll have to have 4 or 5 or 10 years of consistent downturn in world production before you can say statistically it's clear that back there 5 years ago or so, that was the peak. 1 point being a little bit lower than the current trend does not prove that the peak has been passed. So we won't know for at least 5 years after the peak that the peak has actually been passed. It's in our national self-interest to reduce our annual consumption of petroleum right now. Now, you hear people say, and again, these are people who are well-meaning, often well-educated, but don't understand the problem, say that, American agriculture is the most efficient in the world today. That's nonsense. It's the least efficient in the world today. It's the least efficient because if you have to use as your definition of efficiency, how much energy does it take in the form of petroleum, natural gas, etc., to produce 1 unit of energy that's on your dinner table? And that's about 10 units of petroleum energy for 1 unit of food energy on your table. Now, the thing that makes people say we're more efficient is they use a different measure. They say how many person hours on the farm are required to produce 1 unit of food. Well, that number has been going down, leading these people without understanding to say, we're more efficient. We don't use as many people farming as we used to. But that's not a good measure. That's just the measure of we're substituting petroleum for people on the farm. And as petroleum peaks and starts down, we're not going to be able to continue to do that.
That was Albert Bartlett. Next up is another voice that you probably wouldn't associate with the peak oil scene. As far as I know, she didn't really have anything to say on the topic of peak oil specifically, but somehow she came to my attention at a time when I was talking about issues related to agriculture and modern life and farming and that sort of thing. And I think that you'll find what Cornelia Butler Flora had to say on the topic of community and human psychological needs is very much in place here in this collection of interviews. This is from episode 56, Quality of Life, released September 19th, 2007.
What a number of the 9/11 terrorists has demonstrated is that these are people who actually, whose standard of living was fine. And the folks that are being arrested now in England and France and Spain, the issue is quality of life. The things that we have found as we have done studies of quality of life is this: you are respected by the people around you. The notion of inclusion, not being the same as, but being respected by the people around you, turns out to be an incredibly important part of quality of life. And you're respected not for what you have. It's not because of the car you drive. This is why we tend to conflate quality of life and standard of living. But it's based on relationships. And these take time. And you can't just drop relationships on people, whereas you can do things to increase income. It's much more difficult to increase quality of relationships, but we can make investments collectively as a society that can greatly increase the possibilities of people feeling included, respected, and heard. And it seems to me that might be a better investment against terrorism rather than assuming it's all economics. I mean, there has been a really interesting explanation by our president and others that somehow people are jealous of our stuff. And that's why we're having these problems in terms of terrorism. I just read an interesting review of a new book called The Republic, where they're saying, the problem with the internet communities is they are incredibly ideologically similar. So you never talk to anybody who doesn't share all your values and beliefs. And part of quality of life is feeling comfortable around people who aren't like you, so you don't feel you live in some sort of enclave, which you can't venture out of unless you're totally armed. Interacting with and being respected by people who aren't exactly like you definitely helps increase your quality of life. But even more importantly, it really helps create a safer world. It gives you the opportunity to examine your own values and beliefs and to decide what's really important. And what really is important is neither stuff nor homogeneity. And right now, we're, I think, in a crisis of quality of life, not because we don't have enough stuff, but because we have become very fearful that other people somehow want our stuff. And we simply don't understand different ways of seeing the world and different ways of viewing things that can help us then fit ourselves into a very complex and interesting puzzle rather than simply being the answer that's all clearly black and white.
That was Cornelia Butler Flora, the late Cornelia Butler Flora, I'm afraid to say. She's the second of three people that I interviewed for the C-Realm podcast and whose words are recorded here in this book, who has since passed. The other is Albert Bartlett, and then the third is Joe Bageant, who appears late in this book. But next up is an interview or an excerpt from an interview with Bill McKibben. He appeared on episode number 68 of the C-Realm podcast, Durable Communities, released December 12th, 2007.
There's polling data in this country. They've asked Americans every year since the end of World War II, are you happy with your life or not? And the number of Americans who say, I'm very happy with my life, peaks in 1956 and goes downhill since. And that's odd because in that same 50 years, we've trebled our material standard of living. If the economy worked the way we intuitively think it does, those curves shouldn't go that way. It turns out that around the world, once you get past a per capita income of about $10,000 per year, any correlation between more and better scatters, ceases. The plot goes in all different directions. And, that's something we need to know. It's a basic fact about human beings that's as important as knowing, what temperature water freezes at. Because we have geared so much of our life as a country to endlessly expanding the economy past the point where it's producing anything in terms of satisfaction. And since it's also producing great negative consequences, environmentally in particular, it would be good to get a hold of that. It would be good to figure out some other things to be asking our economy to aim for. We've concentrated with obsessive interest on growth, and hence we've largely ignored durability, the idea that we might be building an economy and a society that could last for a long time, that could survive disruptions. And we've ignored this question of whether that growth is producing satisfaction or not. If we aimed for those two things in addition or instead of just endless expansion, I think we'd have more interesting possibilities for getting out of some of the trouble we've gotten into with things like global warming, and for building the kind of society that people actually want to live in, a kind of society that's marked by more connection and more community than we have at the moment. That's what the data shows people are most missing from their lives. Cheap fossil fuel and the affluence that it provides have allowed us to become the first people in the world who have no need of our neighbors. We've taken that to be a good thing and talked a lot about independence and individualism and all of that. But in fact, as the descendants of socially evolved primates who spent all day sitting around grooming each other, it turns out that it's not what we were built for, and it's not what we like. And one of the benefits of getting away from the cheap fossil fuel world we now inhabit will be the inevitable resurgence of more community. We see it happening already. Farmers markets are the fastest growing part of the food economy in this country. And one of the reasons that they're going fast is because people like the experience of shopping at them. The average shopper at a farmer's market has 10 times as many conversations as the average shopper at a supermarket. That's a lot. That's what we're built for. One of the uses of the 20th century was that we found out things that don't work. For instance, huge centrally planned economies where the government tells everybody what to do all the time. Those prove to be a bad idea in a lot of ways. However, that doesn't mean that what does work is everybody doing exactly what they want to and no one ever trying to get together as a community and figure out what makes sense. That is ideologically extreme and is unlike sort of where human beings have come from as sort of Marxist collectivism was. What we need are things that sound and are normal. Communities, neighbors, people figuring out how to do things together. That's what, government at its best is. And there were some tasks that only government can perform. We're going to need to deal with climate change. One of the places where I lost a lot of respect for libertarians in the last decade was that they became in many ways scientific denialists about global warming. All you had to do was read the webpage of the Cato Institute or Reason magazine or things. And one of the reasons was that the chemistry and physics conflicted with their ideology. And that syllogism became markets solve all problems. Markets aren't solving global warming. Therefore, global warming isn't a problem. That's poor logic, but it's emotionally comforting if you're the kind of person who needs some abstract ideological system, Marxism, Leninism, Randian objectivism, whatever it is, to order your life. For the rest of us, what we need is trying to figure out what scale to solve what problems at. And some of those are solved individually, and some of them are solved in your neighborhood, and some of them are solved internationally. And, it's not as comforting as having a one-size-fits-all explanation for everything. On the other hand, those don't work. The logic of the fossil fuel world has been a logic of great globalization, of great disconnection one from each other because we no longer have a practical need for our neighbors. Hence, the logic of a world past cheap fossil fuel, I think, is one where we begin to draw a little closer together again. What we know about human satisfaction would lead us to believe that will have at least as many benefits as costs. And we'll get better at it as we do it. We've lost some of those skills in the last 50 years. We're not that good at cooperating with each other on things, We're all obsessed with the idea that we should pay less taxes and be left alone and whatever. But in fact, the communities that survive best, the people that survive best in more challenging times, are going to be those who live in communities that are able to adapt and work with each other well.
Next up is the name probably most associated with the C-Realm podcast in its entirety, and that is James Howard Kunstler. The segment you're about to hear comes from either episode number 72, The Long Emergency, or episode 73, Cui Bono. They were released on January 9th and 16th, 2008. So this is the first interview in the book that is post-2007. It's from very early, from January of 2008. I want to point out that I was having all of these conversations, which were seemingly academic and speculative in 2007. And then in mid to late 2008, it started to feel very, very real. Anyway, here are excerpts from a C-Realm conversation with James Howard Kunstler.
I think that the most obvious difficult transition for us is going to be what entails the destiny of suburbia, and how we're going to cope with our inability to live in this arrangement that we constructed for ourselves, this elaborate suburban arrangement. I really have no idea how we're going to manage that. I can only think that it will entail a lot of loss, economic loss, and eventually, maybe some fighting over the table scraps of the 20th century. It's going to be very difficult for us to get back to farming at a scale that is appropriate to what our conditions present, because so many of those skills have been lost. But perhaps even more importantly, the difficulty of reallocating land, in smaller parcels to people who know what to do with it. I mean, right now, an awful lot of the ag land in the heartland of America, in the grain belt and, in the center of the country, is owned in very large chunks, in some cases by corporations. And I really don't know how we're going to adapt to the need to do this on a smaller scale. I have to say, I am not a conspiracy theory aficionado. I really don't. I'm allergic to conspiracy theories. I think that an awful lot of what's happened to us has been a totally consensual thing, in the sense that the American public went along with whatever their leaders or corporate plutocracy wanted them to do. So it's been a completely consensual trip the whole way. But the American public is certainly going to be greatly disappointed when things really don't hold together and they discover, well, there aren't going to be hydrogen cars, and there is no realistic way of putting up the hydrogen filling stations all over America, and we're probably just not going to be able to drive as much as we did, if at all. So these things are going to come as huge disappointments to the nation. I do think that the restoration of public space and indeed the restoration of satisfying daily environments in the U.S. Is liable to follow that kind of socially emergent quality that I alluded to earlier. Just as the disaggregation of our towns and cities proceeded from the conditions of the 20th century, namely, and this incredible abundance of cheap oil. So things are going to, I think, reorganize and self-organize in the other direction as we're forced to downscale. The only real big question is how disorderly this process is likely to be, because unlike a lot of other people who think about these issues, I assume that there will be quite a bit of disorder in the process, and that it won't be a simple segue or transition to the next thing, because we're going to be left with an awful lot of liabilities and frankly, just a big myth to clean up. A lot of the stuff that we've invested in over the last 60 years, the shopping malls and the strip malls and all of the automobile infrastructure and the parking lots, most of this stuff doesn't really lend itself to being retrofitted along the lines that a lot of people fantasize about. For one thing, we're probably going to be a much less affluent society in the coming decades than we were in the previous decades. So we're not going to have the investment resources to put into retrofitting the suburbs and the malls. That's why I maintain a lot of those things will end up as either ruins, slums, or salvage yards. We're probably going to have to return to traditional human environments, namely smaller cities, small towns that have a meaningful relationship with productive agricultural surroundings. And, we do have a lot of small towns and small cities in America that are suitable for this. The fate of our larger cities, I think, is somewhat more tragic, because we're not going to be able to maintain these so-called metroplexes in their current scale. And what happens to them is liable to be extremely messy and disorderly, especially the ones that are overburdened with skyscrapers, although there aren't that many of them, mainly New York and Chicago. There are going to be a lot of forces in motion. I think that the redevelopment that we see in the future is going to be on a much smaller increment and a much finer grain than what we've been used to. We're not going to be doing 40-acre redevelopments. We're going to be doing the single building lot in a town, at a time, because the investment is simply not going to be there to do $50 million projects anymore, or $300 million projects. We're going to have to do it on a much finer scale than that. But as we also move into an era in which the car is a diminishing presence in our lives, we're not going to be designing strictly for cars and for motoring anymore. And I think we're going to naturally return to some of the modes of design that, can be described as traditional. And when we do that, we're going to rediscover that the street is the primary public place that we have in our world, and that we're going to find a way to embellish it and honor it that is consistent with a much healthier existence. So, a lot of the traditional things that we understood how to do in architecture and urban design, which we threw in the garbage in the mid-20th century, are going to return, and indeed they are returning already.
That was James Howard Kunstler, a name and a voice and personality that will be familiar to anybody who was following the peak oil scene when it was at its most vital. The next person you're going to hear from is possibly a name that you either don't know, or if you remember it, it's only because he was on the C-Rome podcast once. I'm talking about Colin Tudge, who wrote a book called Feeding People is Easy. Colin Tudge was the guest on episode 77, Agricultural Intelligence, and 78, Fuel versus Food, Not. Released February 13th and 20th, 2008.
If we are serious about wanting to feed people, then we have to start from the very beginning, from first principles, and say, what do we need to do if we want to feed people? And the answer can be provided in one simple sentence, which is, if you want to feed people, you have to design agriculture especially for that purpose. What we need to do is design agriculture to feed people. Now, I call that agriculture in my book Enlightened Agriculture. And the reason I call my book Feeding People is Easy is that I think it really should be possible, if we design agriculture especially to feed people, it should be easy to feed, or fairly easy, to feed everybody who is likely to be born onto this earth forever, and to feed them furthermore to the highest standards of nutrition and gastronomy. If we continue going down the present route, then they're heading for disaster. And I know there are scientists and mathematicians who control all sorts of graphs to show that what they're doing is right, but actually common sense and what's actually happening on the ground shows that what they're doing is absolutely disastrous. I know there are also people who say that if you try to design agriculture, as it were, to feed people, and you start you start re-invoking the kind of methods that people did use 30 years ago or 100 years ago, not that I'm talking about being old-fashioned, but if you do this, then you're simply going backwards. This is regressive, and you have to go forward. You have to get more industrialized and make more money and all that kind of stuff. And to me, this is just nonsense. I think what happened over the last 30, 40, 50 years, it shouldn't be seen as progress. It should be seen as a massive diversion away from common sense. And I think the world has got to come to its senses and say this really is just anomalous what they're doing at the moment. We have to move back to first principles, in effect, redesign, start again, and then I think we're in with a chance. That's basically what I think about that. So if you're really trying to feed people well, provide maximum amount of food easily, you finish up, focus on the arable, fit in the horticulture in the best places, and then just fit in the animals where you can. If you do that, you finish up with a lot of plants, not much meat, and maximum variety. The whole thing becomes very, very varied if you start doing it in this kind of way, using different classes of livestock, different kinds of crops, playing one off against another. If you then say, well, take this little slogan, lot of plants, not much meat, maximum variety. This is what you do if you want to farm well, but it also summarizes the best of the nutritional theory from the last 30 years. In other words, farming that's designed simply to produce lots of good food will also meet human nutritional requirements as well as they can be met. If you now look at all the great cooking in the world, all the great cuisines, and I'm talking about places like India, Turkey, China, southern France, i.e. Provence, Italy possibly being the greatest of all, North African, and indeed from your own country, Cajun cooking and that kind of thing, you find that all the great cuisines also make use of this fundamental pattern of lot of plants, not much meat, and maximum variety. And what this means is that good farming, designed to produce lots of good food, is perfect nutritionally and also support the greatest cuisines that the world has ever produced. And this is why I'm saying that feeding people is easy, because actually if you farm reasonably, according to a basic good principle, basically you don't have to ask people even to be austere. You don't have to ask them to do without. You merely have to ask them to take food very, very seriously, and in fact to become gourmets. And the kind of people who are very easy to feed are people like the Italians who really do understand food, and the Southern French who really do understand food, love their food at the very highest standard. They're very easy to feed because they like a lot of plants, not much meat, maximum variety. So this is the kind of route I want to go down. Now then, the other thing, if you then ask the question, but how do you farm in this beautiful way, lots of plants, maximum, not much meat, maximum variety, how do you do that? The answer is you have to have a very high standard of husbandry, because this kind of farming is very intricate. So you have to have lots and lots of farmers. And if you've got lots and lots of farmers farming intricately, then really you're better off with lots of small farms, family farms, than you are by having very big places, than you are by having very big places and just trying to, produce monocultures. I admire America enormously, and one of the great founders of your country, Thomas Jefferson. I think they got it entirely right in the early 19th century. And one of the things that Thomas Jefferson said was, "I envisage America as a country of small farmers," and it was a country of small farmers until well into the 20th century. And now, as I'm sure you know, you have only 1% of people working on the land in your country. In your country, you've got more people in jail than are working full-time on the land, which I think is a pretty foul statistic. The thing is that you talk to these big industrial types and they say, well, we're interested in farming efficiency. Well, it depends what you mean by efficiency. If you're interested in money, efficiency defined in terms of money, then the system is very efficient because they've cut out all the labor, which means they've cut out most of the cost, which means that they're getting a huge, and they're putting in loads and loads of fertilizer and so on, which means they're getting very, very big yield at very little cost. And in cash terms, it's very efficient. But what we should be talking about, if we're interested seriously in feeding people, and if we're talking about the long-term future, is biological efficiency. In other words, how much energy you're putting in compared with how much energy you're getting out, and how sustainable is it. Can we really go on farming in this kind of way in 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years? If the answer to that is no, then it's not efficient at all. So you see, you see what I mean? I mean, we need exactly the kind of farming that the present industrialists are doing their best to destroy. We need lots of people on the land. We need basically agrarian societies. We need very, very mixed agriculture, whereas these people are trying to create monocultures. Familiar agriculture is designed to produce food, which is entirely different from agriculture that's designed to produce money. And that's my long answer to your question.
That was Colin Tudge. And now, Joe Bageant. Again, unfortunately, the late Joe Bageant. This is from C-Realm Podcast, episode number 149, A Chemical Season of the Mind, released April 15th, 2009.
When I did the book, I had to tie it together. The book is about why working class people vote against their own interests, and I didn't want to write a political book. I wanted to write a human book about people I knew and grew up with. But at the end, I had to tie it together some way, and why would anybody behave this way against their own interest? And so I discussed what I call the American hologram. And it's a self-referential bubble in which the people inside of it, who directly wired particularly to television and movies and media, it's like a snow globe, and a bloody war killing children and disemboweling people and hundreds of thousands of dead is reduced to our boys and the flag and America, a place of church spires and freedom and opportunity. And the hologram gives us that message as if we were inside a snow globe, and the only thing we have to refer to is the language and the images that were fed practically directly to the brainstem from all of our media. It's the uniform message. There's really no big evil guy controlling it. We manifest it in ourselves. But the thing about it is that the system that we've created, which is a malignant system, you'd have to call it malignant when you look at it in the total perspective. Here we are, 6% of the world. We use 36% of its resources. I count water and air, by the way. Most of those counts don't do that. And so, but everybody is a willing prisoner. And that's why I say it's the Stockholm syndrome of the soul. They're willing prisoners. They identify with their captors. Capitalism is an extractive process. It's a faceless machine that exists for one reason, to extract from you production and profit, and as citizens, well, people have been reduced. Most people have been reduced to a market demographic. They're consumers. They're not citizens, in no way are they citizens. No matter how active they are within the system is the problem. But they're prisoners of it. They don't even see that it owns their souls. That the very things they see as solutions are also part of it. Buy green, do this. Capitalism offers you, it co-opts everything and offers it as a product, a consumer identity, and so on. So that's why I say they're prisoners, willing prisoners of their captors. They totally identify. For instance, the bailout of the banks. We cannot live without corporations. Corporations feed us. Corporations give us health. Corporations give us transportation. We cannot let them die. We cannot let the banks die. And so just like the Egyptians making their offerings or the Aztecs stop the temples, we get the bailouts. The extracted sweat of the people is offered up, reserved to vast corporations. Because, as soul prisoners, they will not die if the corporations die, but they believe they will. The evidence around them, tells them, oh, I will die if the banks fail. I will, you know what I mean? The world as I know it will disappear. Well, no, 6% of the world will have their ass up the creek real quick, but the rest of the world is not as affected. If the banks go broke in the third world, gee, what else is new? Yes, it causes a lot of pain and inconvenience, but life is full of pain and inconvenience. I've never made any bones about it. LSD, along with Buddhism and psychology, but particularly LSD, the other two wouldn't have even happened, was the Great Awakening for me. I was a rural kid living in a small town, and I'd read about it when I was in the 9th grade and wanted some. I'd read about it in Life magazine, this terrifying drug, and hell, I'd never even smoked a cigarette in my life, but I wanted some. And anyway, it finally came along from Johns Hopkins. A friend of mine who was being treated for his homosexuality with LSD, we continued his treatment as long as we could possibly push it. And he's bringing it. And it was legal. It was the first 3 years I took it. It was legal. And from the very first time I took it, for once, I saw the world, and I saw how malleable reality was. And when it was done, I sat and cried because I knew life could be this good. I knew there was more meaning there. There was more to be felt and lived, and know, and to be, And so nothing was ever the same after that, because I'd applied myself, like so many other people, not because it was LSD. Same way with ayahuasca. Until very recently, I had a big refrigerator full of it, and I haven't taken it years, but there seems to be a lot of interest in it. Anyway, the expansion of consciousness, you have to call it that, realizing how malleable and that reality is a consensus agreement between people, you could also agree on something else than capitalism and brutal commuting and murdering each other psychologically for jobs. It's possible to agree on something else, and maybe that's why I like the third world in my later years, is that they have agreed on something else. I personally think that it was one of the greatest threats to the system. I mean, my God, the Republicans spent, what was it, $30 million to things like the Heritage Foundation erasing the 60s. It was a terrible threat, because here you had this generation, this baby boom post-war generation that was best fed, best educated, had every reason to be optimistic. I mean, we really believed we were going to win. Now people were told today that we were naive and it was all just bell bottoms, pot smoke, and beads. Well, that's just not so. There was a core of very dedicated people who, essentially, you have to call it spiritual. But anyway, that generation was very well equipped, and so the tide of optimism was just huge. It wasn't all the war in Vietnam. The war in Vietnam was like the war now, but it wasn't the catalyst. Everybody wants to politicize everything. Yes, 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 yes. There were demonstrations. Yes, yes. But the main thing going on was that a generation was becoming consciousness mutants, and in a good way, believing an optimistic, hopeful message of creativity, love, and peace that it was a direct threat to the military-industrial complex, that was built up particularly during World War II.
And finally, this was an interview that I conducted with both Daniel Pinchbeck and Dmitri Orlov. It is from an unnumbered episode of the C-ROM podcast. This is a special Reinventing Reality C-ROM episode, but it is from September 26th, 2008. Again, the guests are Daniel Pinchbeck and Dmitri Orlov.
Personally, I feel like probably a lot of people at the moment in a this interesting paradox where on the one hand I feel anxiety, fear, concern that the food supply will go down and all that kind of stuff as the financial system melts down. On the other hand, I kind of feel like popping the champagne cork because I've always hated the Wall Street system and have felt this incredible manipulation of artificial value, kind of sucking off the the energy from and the life energy from the middle class and the third world countries around the world. And the idea that whole system is now in a paroxysm, I think is kind of an exciting one. And so I do think that there's obviously the potential for things to become very chaotic and dislocated and dangerous, and for the kind of depressing decline that Dmitri outlines to happen. But I also think that there's a whole nother possibility or set of possibilities or set of prospects that are much more positive and much more empowering and equally plausible. Even with the stresses on the ecology, we're still kind of in a world where we could provide for everybody. I mean, if we were to really investigate intensive permaculture practices, scale down waste of resources, really think about the whole planet as a single unified system, we potentially could make tremendous progress. So I still feel that basically the barrier to a kind of positive transformation of human society is our limits in our consciousness and our kind of projections of shadow and negativity onto the system.
Yeah, well, I don't really, have any problem with trying these more optimistic approaches. As far as changing the direction of society, we have to keep in mind that, rational approaches like Buckminster Fuller's are almost beside the point because we're dealing with an atavistic sort of very emotional species that dwells mostly in the realm of images as opposed to any sort of rational thought. That's why everybody insists on having flush toilets and driving cars that have 4 wheels instead of 3, because that's an image that's embedded in the psyche and nothing will dislodge it. Going back to what Daniel said about the collapse of Wall Street, I don't think that it will be replaced with anything better. This is basically a transfer of wealth to foreigners that will be ongoing for quite a while now. And I don't think that they'll be nicer to us than we have been to ourselves. That would be wishful thinking.
The basic fundamental way money has been sort of constructed has a deep flaw in it. We've created a system that's basically debt based. Like you go to the bank, they check your credit rating, see if you can compete aggressively in our contemporary society, and then they loan you a certain amount of money, but they don't create the extra money and interest that you have to bring back. So then you have to go into society and compete with everybody else in the society to bring back that interest, that extra money. So that creates a situation where there's this constantly expanding bubble of debt, and it also creates a mentality of artificial scarcity. And I think what's happening now is that the debt-based expansion, which is at the basis of the capitalist system, is no longer able to function. And the reasons for that are, I think, twofold. One is that we've seen a globalization of the marketplace. If you look at earlier analyses of capitalism, including like Lenin's and Marx's and so on, it requires constant expansion and penetration into new markets to survive. And so that's reached its limit. And one answer to that was like Naomi Klein, the shock doctrine, talks about how they began to, capitalists began almost like look forward to destruction, like hurricanes and terrorist attacks that allowed them to rebuild, aspects of their own society as if they were new markets, but that's clearly unsustainable. And then the other second piece of that is the decline in world energy production. So in a way, like having a debt-fueled expansion model of economics is only going to work as there's an increasing abundance of cheap oil, cheap energy. And then now that energy is no longer available, there's kind of a law of thermodynamics in effect, where the debt is just not going to be recoupable. So the entire debt-based structure of the system is now collapsing. But in a way, I think it's like one of the best things that could possibly happen to us at the moment, because first of all, the post-industrial economy is literally destroying the ecosystems of the planet and immiserating vast populations. So for it to not be able to continue would be a good thing, and for this to happen without nuclear war or martial law, which it might be on the cards. But it seems to be happening in an almost kind of like sudden deflation of the whole hypertrophied enterprise. So I think there's a potential here for a new proposition of value to sort of enter the equation.
What I'd like to say to Daniel is that his optimism. I hope it's it's catchy, because I'm really sick of people telling me that. What I'm proposing is doom and gloom or anything like that, because my point is that life goes on no matter what. You just have to adjust. You have to get rid of some preconceived notions, maybe endure some hardship, but that builds character in some people at least. It's not the end of the world. So I think that I hope that his optimism is helpful, and I enjoyed listening to him and responding to him. So thank you, KMO, and I guess that's it.
The last voice you heard there was Dmitri Orlov, speaking with me and Daniel Pinchbeck. When I decided to revisit this material, I expected to approach it mainly as a record of failed predictions. Back then, I was deeply invested, intellectually, psychologically, emotionally, in the idea of a rapid collapse of industrial civilization. Sitting here in 2026, with the grid still up, the internet still humming, and AI embedding itself into everyday life, it is impossible not to look back critically on the expectations I promoted during that period. But, listening again, I'm reminded that those conversations contained more than just failed predictions. Again and again, guests returned to a simple but profound point. Human flourishing does not actually require the scale of energy use, complexity, and systemic overhead that industrial society demands. Food, shelter, clothing, health, dignity, recognition, community. These are basic human goods. And we've built a civilization that burns staggering quantities of fossil fuel while frustrating our yearning to live meaningful lives. Feeding people is easy. Community is not thermodynamically expensive. Life in industrial society is more expensive than we can afford in the long term. There was a time when I wanted to build a small farmstead for myself and my family and live in community with people who shared that vision. I don't think preparing for collapse is a workable way to create the sort of world I want to live in, but I still think the impulse was motivated by something true. So, getting over collapse is not just an exercise in correcting bad predictions. It's also an attempt to recover what was valuable in that world: the civilizational criticism, the psychological insight, the intuition that a viable human life may require much less energy throughput than the system insists. If you want to follow that project, you can sign up for updates at crome.org. All right, that's all for now. Stay well.